Welcome to Part 1 of training for new modifications made to CAPS for APS placements, services, and expenditures. Beginning immediately, we will start entering all placements, services, and payments in CAPS for adults with APS cases. All adults will have a placement even if it is in their own home, as you will see in this training. All entries in the Old Placement tab need to be entered in the New Placement Services Payment tab. In this training, I will demonstrate how to enter level of care and no-cost placements. CAPS has a new tab where you will find most of the new modifications for APS. The tab is called the Placement Services Payment tab, which is abbreviated as you see on this slide. The new tab contains 4 subtabs. The first one is the Placement subtab. Second is the Services subtab. Third is the Level of Care subtab. And fourth is the P-Card subtab. Let's start with the Level of Care subtab. Click the Update button in the upper right corner of the screen, then click the Add button in the lower right corner. A box will appear that has fields for start date and end date, and a drop-down with options for level of care. I entered the date that the level of care was determined in the Start Date box. You will only enter an end date if this level of care ends and a new one is determined and entered. I also selected Assisted Living / CRCF from the drop-down list. The entry I made shows on the grid of the LOC subtab. Click the Commit button to save it to the case record in CAPS. Notice that the bottom of the Placement and Services subtabs have fields to show how much money we estimate we're spending on this adult based on the information entered in the Placement and Services tabs. Additional costs such as food, clothing, and prescriptions, and the total we have paid so far for placements and services, as well as a level of care, appear at the bottom of the screen. A total amount for all entries that have a cost associated with them will show here as well. Now we will add a placement. Click on the Placement subtab and click Update in the upper right corner of the screen to begin. Then click the Add button in the lower right corner of the screen. The Add APS Placement screen appears. It opens to the No Cost Placement screen. The Type drop-down box also has an option for placements with costs that we will discuss in another video. I selected No Cost Placements from the drop-down for this demonstration. Let's look at the fields on the screen. CAPS populates the Entered By field based on who is logged in and doing this work. There are 2 subtabs on this screen, the Case Information subtab and the Placement Services subtab. The fields on the Case Information subtab are populated from information entered in other CAPS screens. The adult's name, county, birth date, age, and gender fields are populated from information entered in the intake. The Custody field is populated from information entered in the DSS Custody tab. The Level of Care field is populated from the information I entered earlier on the Level of Care tab, and the SSA, SSI, Medicaid, and Medicare information is populated from information entered on the Medical Administration tab of the Person screen. All of this information is necessary for the approver of a request to see in one snapshot as it shows here. Now let's enter a placement. Every adult will have a placement even if we aren't paying for it, so that we always know where the adult is located. Also, anyone else reviewing our case can find this information quickly and easily. I begin by entering the start date of the placement. I won't enter an end date until the placement ends or the case is closed. The estimated end date field isn't required for a no-cost placement, but it is for placements with cost, as we will see later. I selected Adults Home for the placement type. Notice that the provider field is grayed out and you cannot enter information in it for this type of placement. If you select Relatives Home, this field is also grayed out. The Placement Services subtab has fields for placement location and comments. This slide shows the address I already entered in the person screen for the adult to show how it populates the placement screen. That address from the person screen populates the placement location field if you have already entered it in the person screen. An entry in the comments field is required to submit a placement entry. After I enter all the required information, I enter the date that I'm entering the placement and I click the Send to Supervisor drop-down to see a list of APS supervisors. We are including more than just your supervisor in case another supervisor is covering your county at the time you enter a placement or service. I selected the supervisor I want to send this request to and clicked Submit. The request shows on the grid at the Placement subtab with a status of Submitted to Supervisor. Now let's look at a placement that requires a provider to be entered. On this screen, I entered the start date and selected Emergency Room, Emergency Department as the placement type. Notice the provider field is not grayed out. This is also the case for placement type entries of Addiction Rehab Facility, Hospital Admission, Psych Facility, and Shelter. This screen can be a bit misleading. You will not enter the provider's name in the provider field. Instead, you will click the search button to enter the provider's name. The search button brings up the provider search screen. Enter the provider's name. In this example, I entered Prisma, then I clicked Search. A list of providers that have been entered in caps appears. If there's not a provider with the name you entered, you will be prompted to enter a new provider. We will discuss that process later in this video. The provider's name now appears in the provider field of the placement subtab. I enter the entry date and select the supervisor I want to send this to. In this case, I selected myself so that I can show you how this all works for a supervisor. In real-life caps, we won't be able to do this. If you click the Submit button without completing all the required fields, you will get a message like this one. I need to enter comments in the Placement Services subtab. Notice that the provider's address automatically populates the placement location field. I must manually enter comments, then I can submit this request. When I click Submit, the entry shows on the Placement subtab with a status of Submitted to Supervisor. Notice that the first entry I made for the Adults Home now has an end date. CAPS will automatically enter an end date for a previous placement when a new placement is entered. The supervisor will get an alert notification that an entry needs their attention. You can access the alerts from the Alerts menu at the top of the screen. The alert screen will open. Click on the underlined blue number to take you directly to the case that contains the request. Also, the description field shows this is a placement request, which tells you the request can be found on the Placements tab. You will make selections from the Recipient and Program Services drop-downs and click Update in the upper right corner of the screen. Then click the Placement Services Payment tab. This request is for a placement and shows on the Placements tab, which is the first one that appears when you click the Placement Services Payment tab. Click on the entry to highlight it, and click Update in the lower right corner of the screen. The screen will open with all the information the case manager entered for you to review. After you review the entry, check the Reviewed box and enter the date you reviewed the entry, then click Submit. For no-cost placements, the supervisor will only need to review the information. Placements with cost and services will require supervisor approval to be submitted to the state office for final approval. We will see this process in a later video. The entry now shows in the grid on the Placement subtab with a status of Reviewed. No other action is necessary for this type of placement. The case manager will receive an email once the supervisor has reviewed the request and clicked Submit, notifying them that the request has been reviewed. Now let's go through the process to enter a new provider. This process works for all placement types and services except one-time or intermittent services. I entered the start date and placement criteria and clicked the Search button on the left side of the screen. The provider search box appeared and I entered the provider name and clicked the other search button on the right side of the screen. I got a message that no provider records were found. You might get a list of providers with similar names but not the one you are looking for. In that case, you will enter a new provider as well. Click the Create New button to enter a new provider. The Placement Provider screen will appear. Enter the provider's name in the organization name field. Select Active from the status drop-down. Click APS Provider in the Provider Type field. Then scroll down the placement type list until you find the correct option and highlight that option. The checkbox will remain blank after you select the option you want. Next, click the Add button beside the Address field. On the Add Address screen, select the address type as Business Location 1 and enter the street address, city, zip code, county, and start date. The country and state fields are already populated but can be changed. Click the Validate Address button. You might get a screen like the one shown here if there's more than one possibility for the address you entered. You might also get a message that the address doesn't exist, with options of actual addresses to pick from. For this demonstration, I selected the last option shown and clicked the Select button. CAP shows that the address is legitimate by turning the check mark green. Click OK at the bottom of the screen. The address appears in the grid. If you want to add a phone number, click the Add button beside the phone field. The last step is to add a contact person. Click the Relationship tab to do this. Enter the name of the contact person, then click the Search button. A list of matching and similar names will appear. Select the name from the list if it's there. If it doesn't appear, click Create New. Enter the person's last name and first name, then click Next. Click Next on the next two screens that appear, and click Confirm on the last screen. You do not have to enter any information in these screens. The Add Relationship Data screen appears with the person's last and first names populated. Select Provider from the Role drop-down and enter the date you make this entry in the Start Date field, then click OK. The name appears in the relationship grid. Click OK again. You will get a message shown here. Click Yes to add additional information or No to complete the process. The new provider's name you entered shows in the provider field of the APS Add Placement screen. Continue entering the request as outlined earlier in this video. Thank you for taking time to watch this training video. Part 2 will cover placements with costs.